Morning everybody and welcome to the first Urban Living webinar of 2025, and we are starting with a meaty subject. We're going to talk today about how the living sector can play its part in addressing the UK's housing crisis. My name's George Sell, editor of Urban Living News, and we are an online B2B multimedia platform for the living and hospitality industries. Today's webinar will be an hour long. We're going to have around 45 to 50 minutes of conversation with our panelists. We'd like to make it as interactive as we can, so if you have any questions, please do submit them using the chat or the Q&A function in Zoom. We may answer them there and then, or we might have to save a bit of time at the end of the session. Everybody who has registered for the webinar will receive a link to a recording of it in the next few days. So before we meet our panelists, I just wanted to give the conversation a bit of context with a couple of slides, just to kind of give some background to the conversation. And this one contains quite a lot of numbers, some of them quite startling. So that there are 1.33 million households on local authority housing waiting lists. That's households, not individuals. The government has set a well-publicised target for 1.5 million homes to be built during this parliament, which equates to around 370,000 a year. However, for the first 6 months of this period, output was down 10%. Though the government is expecting that to rise in the next couple of years. An MHCLG report estimates that 30 to 50,000 new later living homes are needed per annum to meet the need that's out there already. But only 7,000 a year are being built. And CBRE thinks there is a shortage of around 600,000 student beds. So the problem that we're talking about is there in every tenure and every asset class. The housing crisis is making a lot of headlines across all forms of media. Some of these headlines are quite alarming. Some of them are based in fact, some of them are perhaps a bit alarmist. On the plus side, we are seeing some serious institutional investment coming in to try and address the problem. So GMPF there, that's the Greater Manchester Pension Fund. But the housing crisis is essentially holding back the entire country's economy, not just that of London, which you can see in the top right-hand story there. So those are some stories from across the media, but on our own Urban Living News website, we're running a lot of stories about the various elements of the topic we're talking about today. The investment side is looking quite positive, although it's estimated that £300 billion is needed to meet UK rental housing demand. It's thought that the living sector alone will be attracting 45 billion of that by 2029. Planning consents for the various living sector asset classes are going up. Build to rent, you can see in the top left there, is up 35%. The Salford co-living scheme in the top right is an interesting one. I think that's the first one in the area to have a proportion of affordable housing provision, affordable rent mandated in the scheme. I can't remember if it's 20 or 25%, but a good chunk of the units there are at affordable rent. And the bottom left one is pertaining to the Radix Big Tent Housing Commission, which we'll find out a bit more about shortly. So let's get cracking. We've got a fantastic panel with us today. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves briefly, and we'll go from left to right. So first of all, James, welcome to you.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Good morning, George, and morning to the rest of the panel and everyone online. Yeah, my name's James Pargeter. I'm a senior advisor at GAA, specialist consultants to the the purpose-built rental sector. Also have ancillary roles at British Property Federation, at the Association for Rental Living. I'm now actually, I know Lisa will talk about the Radix Housing Commission. There is a follow-up group that is taking on some additional work in that. I'm part of that, and also part of the recently announced Build to Rent task force.
Thank you, James. Hannah, good morning to you.
Morning. Thanks very much for having me on the panel. Very excited. I'm the founder and CEO of Hyber. We are a student slash kind of graduate rental platform that matches first-time renters to great housing and makes sure they have all the support that they need throughout that journey. And for property operators across the residential market, we've built a lettings platform that automates the journey from listing to offer, to remove manual processes and saving teams around 10 hours per listing.
Thank you, Hannah. Next, over to you, Lisa.
Thanks, George. Morning, everybody. So I'm a partner at Shoesmiths. We're a law firm, but my specialism is in planning law, so navigating the complexities of the ever-changing planning system. I also co-head the firm's living sector, which led me to, as James has mentioned, the Radix Big Tent Housing Commission, which I was involved with last year. That involved a group of various disciplined professionals from across the sector coming up with a series of recommendations, which we published in October last year, and we'll hopefully talk about some of those today. And as James mentioned, that commission is carrying on the work. We've co-opted various additional people to that panel to carry on that work throughout this year and to help guide the government and policy changes as they're happening.
Thanks, Lisa. And finally, Geeta, good morning to you.
Morning. I'm Geeta Nanda, and I was Chief Executive of Metropolitan Thames Valley Housing Association, which had around 60,000 homes across London, the South East and into the Midlands. And I retired from 40 years of being in the Affordable Housing Association sector, and now I'm doing a series of non-exec roles as well as some advisory work across the private rental sector, homelessness and affordable housing sector. So a whole range of different perspectives really to get us building more homes.
Great stuff. Thank you, Geeta. You'll be able to see our panelists' LinkedIn profiles in the chat. So if you'd like to get in touch with them and carry on the conversation after the webinar, then drop them a line through there. James, I'd like to start with you, and let's sort of kind of define what we're talking about in terms of the housing crisis. What do we need now, and what are the long-term housing needs of the future? Perhaps you can give us a sort of a snapshot of the situation.
Yeah, I mean that's the fundamental question, isn't it? What are we going to need? I think the key for me is always to sort of a bit turn the telescope around and see what we need in the future rather than the backlog we're trying to make up for from the past. And what I mean by that is looking at some of those fundamental assumptions that underpin or have underpinned housing policy over the last few decades, and see, are those still relevant for the future? And so that's why it really feeds into a better quality rental sector through build to rent in all its forms, as we're going to discuss. Because I think the foundation of housing policy has been this assumption that people leave home, go to leave school or university, maybe rent for a short period, perhaps with friends, get into a relationship, start a family, and basically live in buy somewhere as soon as they can possibly afford it, and then live out their lives until retirement. And I think there's a lot in that sort of very simplified structure of how people are imagined to live that is no longer necessarily relevant. And I think if you asked an early 20-something now about their career path, for example, would they say, I want to get into a good job, stay there for 45 years and retire? I don't think I can't imagine anyone saying that anymore, whereas a generation ago perhaps that was quite a widespread aspiration. So I think there is an inherent flexibility in modern society and modern economy and modern life, which is not being addressed by a housing policy that assumes that you either buy somewhere or you're in the affordable sector, and somehow that those two pots of housing can cover all the bases for everybody, because I just simply think that isn't true anymore. So.
Yeah, thanks, James. Geeta, you've got a very good overview of this. You've got the housing association perspective, the house builder, the build to rent provider, and the homeless charity. So what's your kind of view of how housing needs are evolving, and is the provision of that housing evolving fast enough to meet the different ways that people live that James has just alluded to?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that, you know, I think for decades we've said we've had a housing crisis. We haven't been building enough homes for a long time. And the thing about now is that it is impacting everybody across every bit of the sector. So whether, you know, I was on the older person's task force, whether you're older person getting into the most appropriate housing, whether you're a young person trying to buy your own first home, whether you're trying to rent in the private rental sector. And, you know, that sort of saying which says you're as happy as your most unhappy child or something like that is, you know, rough sleeping and homelessness is absolutely through the roof. You know, 26% increase in rough sleeping in London. So, you know, housing is a whole ecosystem. And if you get pushed out of one bit, you get pushed into another bit, and that puts pressure on another bit. So, you know, in affordable housing, in social housing, social rent, there hasn't been enough built for many, many decades. And the impact of that is felt in the private rental sector, the impact on rough sleeping, you know, the fact younger people can't afford to buy their first home, or, you know, that is huge demand on shared ownership and other kind of, you know, products really that are helping people get housed for a period of time. So I think, you know, building on what James says, I think there's a difference in aspirations. I think some people don't think they're ever going to buy now, whereas they probably always thought they did. You know, the fact that there's a reality that it's going to be so difficult to get into affordable housing, social rented housing, means there is a lot more pressure on private rental of all sorts, you know, and the biggest need that we have as a nation is in affordable, whether you buying or renting, is, you know, for people who are earning that slice, which is, you know, over 25,000, under 50,000, that sort of slice of housing is very, very difficult for people to enter. So how do we build more of the right homes in the right tenure for people who most need it? And I think that sector of the crisis is where we also need to focus.
Thank you, Geeta. Lisa, one of the things the government has done recently is reveal its updated planning system, the NPPF. What are the main takeaways from that, and how will that affect housing delivery as a whole, and specifically in the living sector?
The changes to the NPPF, I think, I mean, the government got them out quickly, which was really good and was really desperately needed by the particularly the house building side of the sector. In a way, what it was really doing though was correcting what had kind of gone wrong over the last couple of years in terms of the mandatory housing targets for local authority. The removal of those a couple of years earlier had led to a real slowdown and a real kind of planning by appeal kind of way of doing things that just clogged up the system. We're not really out of that, I don't think, with the changes that have been made, but I think, like a lot of other things, it's all in the right direction of travel to help, certainly to help more consents be delivered. I think there's a whole other question about, once you've got the consent, about then actually delivering the homes on the ground. And there's a multiplicity of factors really that go into that, you know, the NPPF, the planning system, can't solve by itself. All the planning system can really do is deliver the consents to build. It can't get people actually building. I think one of the key things that's been talked about that I'm not sure is necessarily a kind of main driver of making things happen is this grey greenbelt debate. I think, to me, again, I think that's a little bit of a distraction, really, and it's kind of something to show that the government, you know, are being robust about not all greenbelt is sacrosanct, and there can be some delivery of good schemes on there. But I slightly think, you know, that there was the report from the House of Lords Commission yesterday that said it was obviously rushed through, not fully thought through what the implications of that grey belt definition would be. And certainly as a planning lawyer, I can see there being endless debates about what it actually means going through the courts, and planning barristers being very busy talking about it for the next couple of years. And I think that's a bit of a distraction. It's a kind of headline thing. So I think overall, really positive in terms of the direction of travel. It shows a commitment to, you know, not just accepting the NIMBY arguments and allowing things to be delivered. So step in the right direction. But I mean, Geeta mentioned the word ecosystem. That was one of the things we talked about a lot on the Housing Commission. It's that knock-on effect of things. Just tinkering with one bit over here doesn't fix the whole thing. It's got to be looked at as a whole. So the NPPF changes, yes, an important part of all of that, but just one piece of the jigsaw, really.
Lisa, I was hoping that the reinstated housing targets might include a specific mandate for a certain percentage of rental housing, a certain amount of later living housing. Why do you think the government stopped short of doing that?
I mean, my own view is that to mandate numbers in that is really difficult to do, because it is a localized thing, because, you know, the housing needs of an area are very specific to that area, and it's a question of how wide you go with that area. And I think the move towards regional spatial planning is really positive in that. But my personal view is that the NPPF certainly wouldn't be the place to put numbers on that. It could perhaps have been more encouraging of local planning authorities to look at the needs of their area and include it in their local plans. But I think from a kind of house builder living sector perspective, there are so many hurdles in terms of delivering on site, and arbitrary mandatory targets, whether they're affordable housing, later living, it kind of creates constraints then on what could be delivered. And, you know, we'll come on to talk about Section 106 and affordable housing. It becomes a bit of a kind of collar that you're then constrained within. And people have already mentioned flexibility today. I think being fleet of foot and being flexible is actually more important than tying things down to mandatory targets that aren't necessarily deliverable.
Thanks, Lisa. Another thing that I think is important is normalising multi-tenure developments rather than having lots of separate plots addressing single markets. Hannah, can you give us your take on multi-tenure development?
Of course, and I think it kind of links to a word that everyone's been kind of alluding to or spoken about, which is that we're making assumptions. And I think a lot of the issues that kind of goes into the housing crisis question, as well as the multi-tenure developments, is that we've seen a real reluctance within our sector to adopt technology. And what we're really missing is a holistic data set across all aspects of the residential market, PBSA, HMO, wider PRS, build to rent, co-living, the affordability sector, so we can see the search data of what are people searching for, what rents can people actually afford, what type of housing do people actually want to live in. And then we're seeing the missing product, and we're actually making those decisions of what should we be building, what should we be, further developing retrofit projects based on tenant data, because as we've all said, the renters' needs and wants are changing, and we need to keep up to date with exactly what the next generation of renters actually want to live in. And the kind of two examples that come to mind when we're looking at the multi-tenure developments is, of course, the first one being build to rent, having been such a great example, and co-living, of different tenants living together in one building. And I think always the debate is, can you build and cater for two different tenant types within one block, one community? And I think the answer is definitely yes. if you look at the number of student renters, for example, that chose build to rent over PBSA last year, it's because of the design of BTR, of that wanting that more social space of living with 2-3 people in slightly bigger apartments. But it also validated that students and professionals can live really well together. And again, using technology to be able to segment your user base so you can have personalized experience, whether you are a professional or a student, based on the comms that you get. You can really digitalize that within a building, so that your app and your way that you kind of interact with the manager is different based on who you are. And the kind of second example is what we're starting to see. You've definitely got really good examples across Europe. For example, a Dutch nursing home in Geneva with elder kind of seniors living with students, again, with senior living mixing with students. And I think these are lovely examples because it's part of this sort of need of no room should be empty, and we should be thinking creatively about every house within the UK of, if there's any empty rooms, how can we bring people together, making sure we're matchmaking, again, using technology to matchmake tenants based on what they want to get out of that living experience. But we're thinking creatively so that no room is empty, and we're creating, really special communities. We're not assuming we know what tenants want. We're asking them whether they'd want to live near a senior, whether they'd want to live near a professional with a student, if they could be matched based on what they want to get out of that property. So again, I think it all comes down to making sure we're putting the power back in the tenant's hands, and we're then able to customize the journey using different operating platforms, using technology, and then we can encourage different types of living together.
Thanks, Hannah. James, how comfortable do you think the various groups of stakeholders in the development process, so that your investor, your developer, your operator, how comfortable are they with the multi-tenure concept, or are we still at the start of that particular journey?
Well, I think I would like to think very comfortable. I mean, I think there are lots of examples coming through now. I spent 5 years at Greystar from 2016 to 20, sort of, and those are my personal experience, sort of best examples. There are plenty around, from the in London, Manchester, quite a lot of big cities where, by the nature of their locations, you really want a mixed tenure community to evolve. And actually, for me, the beauty, having been involved with build to rent since its sort of very early days, and actually when Thames Valley, and Geeta was my client at this stage, when Thames Valley set up Fizzy Living, that was kind of one of the first high profile forays into build to rent. It was, the first scheme was fairly modest, but it got us all thinking, what if we could do this better? And it was all that, and that was a mixed tenure scheme. It was and subsequent ones, for example, the Greenford Quay in Ealing is over 2,000 homes. Even Greystar thought, well, we can't possibly do that as all market rent, and obviously there's going to be an affordable element to that, which is largely intermediate rent. But 2 of the 7 residential blocks were designated as for sale with some shared ownership. So there's and of course you've got some commercial and retail space in there as well, and community infrastructure and doctor surgeries and things. So you can make a really, that was a really good opportunity because it was a large site. You could do all those things on the one site. But I think those principles, in terms of building something that creates a place where people actually want to be, both to live and work, and come and do their shopping and leisure as well. That's what makes a really good place. And I think the investors in those sort of schemes are very, very clear about how that can be, how attractive that is for that long-term placemaking and the generation of a stable rental income as a result. And I just wanted to sort of echo Hannah's point about the sort of integration of the affordable housing element within that build-to-rent scheme. And to my mind, and I'm sure there are others, but that was the first time that we talked very closely to Ealing and to the GLA to make sure that the intermediate housing was not designated. These are redlined on a plan, but we said, here is a accommodation mix that we will make sure is kept accurate as time goes on, but individuals have the need for flexibility within their own lives. So as time changes, someone could change tenure within the same apartment, and the benefit of the discount could move to a different apartment. And so what that meant was that every apartment was fitted out to the same specification. Everyone had the same facilities. No one needed to know which tenure group their neighbours were in, unless they chose to talk about it between themselves. So there was there was all a single entrance, single access to all the same amenities. So there's absolutely no question of poor doors or any of these things which have dogged these sort of efforts in the past. And I think that sort of model is a really healthy one that should be grown across many other places.
Thanks, James. Geeta, what was the catalyst for Fizzy Living? Because that was quite a bold move at the time for housing association to become a build to rent pioneer, if you like. Did the idea come from seeing multifamily in the US? How did it come about?
Yeah, I think it was, with every downturn, there's an opportunity, and we'd had a big downturn, 2008, the big downturn, and it was like, well, what's the opportunity? And as a housing association, we're looking at the opportunity, student housing, the opportunity is rental housing, and then going to the States and seeing what they were doing and going to talk to investors in the UK. The investors in the UK were very, very cautious and for thinking about it, not sure about it, wanted to prove the model. So as a housing association, and housing associations have been very brilliant over the 100 years that they've existed, to look at where there's market failure, how do you come in as a housing organisation to deal with that? And decades ago it used to be those streets of Notting Hill and Islington and everything where nobody wanted to live and doing them up. And this felt to me like, something we should be involved in, because if we could get investment into it, and there were no professional managers, well, housing associations are professional managers. If we could adapt that model, then, it could kickstart investment in the UK. And that's what it did, actually. It was, proving something very, as James said, quite modest, proving it, and then through proving the model, bringing investment in. And then once investment came in, and the investment was from Adia, but once the investment came in, then more UK investors then got involved, your Legal & Generals and M&Gs and then of course many from Greystar came over. So there was, many investors that sort of came in. So I think it's really about somebody being brave enough to prove a model and then move on. And, actually, if you can't house everybody in the affordable rented sector, then there is the private rental sector. But the private rental sector has been always the sort of shoddy bit. And I think building on what Hannah and James said, we've had multi-tenure for many years. I live in a street, where there's housing association, council housing, market sale, housing, students living in here. So for me, it's all about the management. And when we had mono-tenure estates, big, large mono-tenure estates, that wasn't the right thing to do. And regeneration, which has been breaking up those estates and having more and different tenures in them, have led to more thriving places. And the problem with people who bought through right to buy and then rented those properties out is that they were the most troublesome tenants often, because there was no proper management. So making sure we think about the place, the common spaces, the management, means we will have successful multi-tenure. So for me, it's really about thinking through the management, the place, how those, how different people can move across the tenures and move across different buildings and have that open and good space as well within it, as well as what Hannah's talking about, technology, which is, I think, adding another layer on top of that as to how we can have proper communities within and with, throughout these whole developments. So, you know, I think we're coming a long way, and it's good to see different and varied models coming through to help solve these problems.
Yeah, thanks, Geeta. Lisa, can you tell us a bit about how new developments in the living sector are providing their affordable obligations? The co-living scheme in Salford that I mentioned earlier has obviously got, it's either a fifth or a quarter of its units at an affordable rent rather than a market rent. Is that becoming more typical for the provision, the affordable provision, to be part of the development, or is it often off-site via Section 106?
It's varied over the years, I would say. I don't think there's been a particular move now to have more on site. I think it's been more difficult to achieve in that kind of build to rent, co-living, what would be seen by local planning authorities as newer types of delivery. And certainly, and I'm based in Manchester, and that scheme's just down the road from me, and there's in Salford and Manchester, there's been a kind of real difference about how those two authorities have gone about things, with Manchester not historically getting any affordable housing in city centre developments, and that is now starting to change, and they are, you know, there's a lot of high-rise towers going up, and there is now much more affordable requirements as part of those developments. So I think it is changing in that kind of urban context, but you know, in house builder schemes, it's been going on for years that there's been a proportion of affordable housing delivered. The difficulty in recent years has been the ability then of housing associations to take that Section 106 housing, because there just isn't the grant funding around that there was. So there's now house builders who are saying we literally can't find a housing association willing to take the on-site affordable housing. And so quite often those Section 106 agreements are very inflexible in terms of how they were drafted. They could have been drafted 5-10 years ago, and with very little flexibility or cascade mechanisms that allow, you know, again, it's that fleet of foot flexibility point that can, you know, create a kind of situation where you can't get any more market housing delivered because the affordable housing, there's nobody to take it. So I think, again, it's about adapting to current environments and the availability of grant funding. And actually Section 106, it's a very inefficient way to deliver affordable housing, because it's not necessarily at scale. There's the requirement for pepper potting, which means it can be difficult for housing associations to then manage. So it's been a way of, I guess, requiring developers and house builders to contribute to affordable housing, but actually I think there must be more efficient ways to do that and capture it in a better way. And I think that needs to be the way forward if we're going to deliver affordable housing at scale, particularly if we're going to do it without mass council housing building programs, which I'm not sure we're quite in that realm as yet in terms of just the funding.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. James, looking at the build to rent and PBSA markets, there's a lot of fairly premium product out there. Rents are high. We quite often talk about the amenity arms race, where a lot of these new developments have got every bit of kit possible, perhaps not always used as much as they should be. Do you think we've kind of come to the end of that particular cycle, and we might see a kind of new wave of amenity light build to rent and student housing with lower rents, which opens up a much bigger potential target customer demographic?
Well, I would love to see that. I think the answer actually to your question is both yes and no, because I think there's always going to be a place for the higher end product in particular locations. I think the problem with the policy as it's been applied so far is because of because of the lack of grant and things in delivering affordable housing that Lisa's just touched on, and the difficulty for that to be financed separately, affordable housing has been delivered through Section 106 very largely over quite a long period of time now, and I think the theory behind that is that it's kind of somehow penalising the developer, and I think the reality is that the people who get penalised by that are actually the market residents who end up paying more for their homes, whether they're for sale or for rent, than otherwise. So I think if you apply that principle to a build to rent product, you say, well, you can build these. Let's talk about a high density apartment building, but it could be houses as well. But build these, but you've got to provide, in London, say 35% of that's got to be affordable. Well, that needs to be subsidised, and if there is no subsidy coming in through the grant route, where is that subsidy actually coming from? Well, it's probably coming from the market rents. So my problem with that is that in the sale market, it's kind of invisible. It goes on to that subsidy probably results in higher house prices. And people are generally happy about that for peculiar cultural reasons, but it goes on to people's mortgages, and it's largely invisible. When it's in the rental sector, and it results in higher rents, that brings two problems. A, you get the pushback from people saying, "Oh, we didn't think these rents should be as expensive as they are, because they're probably higher than they need to be if you were not providing any affordable housing." And by the way, I'm not arguing for that. I think we need to find a right balance here. But if you're charging higher rents to afford the subsidy to put into the affordable element, then you've got to justify those higher rents with the higher amenities. So I think we've been in a phase of that, which has been useful. And as Geeta said, it's a proof of concept, doing these things to prove. Because if you look back 10 or 12 years ago, the big question is, why on earth would anyone invest in this type of property? It's on paper, in valuation terms, it was worth less than for sale property. So why on earth would you do it? So we've got over that barrier. There's a lot of capital there wanting to invest in purpose-built rental housing, but I suppose what I would love to see now is a bit more saying, that part of the sector is always going to exist, the higher end stuff, but actually, how do we tackle the mid-market? How do we tackle those people on middle incomes? And we partly do it through, where the local authorities understand it and are amenable to it, is providing the affordable element as intermediate rent, which serves key workers and people very well. But I think there's still a big cliff edge from the top of that range to the open market. And I think what I would love to see is a bit more flexibility about whether it's the percentage of that affordable housing, or whether it's another category beyond that of sort of, in America they would call it workforce housing, where people on in good jobs, but on relatively modest incomes, who would never be eligible for council housing, no matter how many of them you built, but they are still not being so. To summarise that, the policy, if you take the policy saying, here comes a build to rent. I mean, the thing that appealed to me about build to rent was it could provide housing in that mid range. And what's happened through policy is if you aim at the mid-range, you are then repolarized into higher end rental prices for the market element, because you're subsidizing the affordable element, which is fine. I'm not, I'm a pro housing person. All of it's good, but actually you kind of miss that middle, because you're being shifted to one end or the other. And actually the people who are in the middle, who and there are a lot of them, who really need those homes to be at a sort of modest rental level, are being failed by that system. And something I think needs to change quite radically about that.
Yeah, thank you, James. Geeta, we've established that Section 106 is a fairly blunt instrument. Are there any other models of affordable and social home delivery elsewhere in the world that we could look at and perhaps draw inspiration from, particularly when it comes to this squeezed middle, as James described there?
I mean, Section 106 has delivered a lot of affordable housing, you know, quite successfully over the decades, because once it's enshrined, you've got a clear percentage, and then it's reflected in the land value. You know, so once it's a sort of clear model that's been known about, then it can deliver housing. The key problem is that it's not just insufficient grant at the moment, it's the fact that housing association model, which has been about borrowing because the grant rates haven't been high enough over many years, they now can't keep borrowing because they can't pay the interest bill because of the cost of maintaining their existing homes and building safety issues, etc. So, you could recapitalise housing associations. They could then go out and do more Section 106. So, that there isn't a way to solve the current problem if we wanted to. But I do agree that this kind of intermediate, which shared ownership has filled that gap. And actually, when I talk about shared ownership to many other people in many cities across Europe, they think it's a great idea because they don't have anything like that, and they're all grappling. A lot of cities are grappling with the fact that housing is becoming unaffordable. But I do quite like the zoning thing that you have in the States, because if you can zone and you can accept that you need intermediate housing, then that works as well. So you can say, in the States have discounted market rent, so the rent is not as high or as low as social housing and not as high as the market intermediate rent, we call it here. And we have rent to buy schemes as well, but there's just not enough of it. And it's not enough of it because local authorities got such a massive, they're going bust over the fact that they've got to house homeless people. They haven't got the money. They desperately need social rented homes. But so we're in this conundrum of we can't build enough intermediate rented homes because the need for social rented homes is so high. So we end up not building enough homes. So I think we just need to we've got the mechanisms, we've got planning, we've got, local authorities, we've got housing providers, we've got councils, we've got now for-profit providers, we've got a lot of investment coming in. So we just need to be able to now push it out so that we build and accept that intermediate housing is a very high need, and we need to prioritise that as much as other housing in order to get more of that built. And then it is simply about prioritising it. And you can call it zoning, you can call it subsidies, you can call it what you want, but it is about accepting that unless we can prioritise those group of people, you're going to put more pressure on the social housing and more pressure on people trying to club together to buy or rent in more overcrowded situations, because that's the only way they can do it.
Thank you, Geeta. Hannah, one thing we have got less of in that intermediate piece are the small to medium private landlords who are operating HMOs. We've seen a lot of those leave the market, but you've got an interesting idea for how that particular sector could be an opportunity for institutional investors to sort of professionalize that HMO piece.
Yeah, I think firstly that there's been, the data doesn't quite match up to what we've been hearing in the press. I think actually it's been a much slower process, and although rents aren't going to continue rising 10-15% year on year like we've seen in Bristol, Manchester and other student specific cities, it's still a great investment opportunity. But I think based on, again, like piggybacking off what everyone's been saying, cost of finance, cost of development means it's really hard to be building that mid-tier stock that we know is really in need from renters. And so I think the opportunity there is for portfolio landlords to be buying up residential kind of portfolios, and for investor-backed HMO portfolios. In the past, investors have always overlooked HMO as a kind of investment strategy, and that's been mostly because of how difficult it is to operate an HMO portfolio at scale. But now, again, with technology, now that you have lettings management platforms like what we're building, some great property management systems out there, it makes it much more easy to operate these portfolios at scale centrally. So you don't need to have very expensive kind of city branches across the portfolio. So again, using technology, you can really bring your operating costs down so that you can build more and you can develop, you can invest in more affordable housing. And that's the kind of point I'm going to keep on coming back to, because I think it's so often overlooked in these conversations. And actually, if we think about how do you keep rents down, it's by looking across that P&L when you're looking at a new project, and everyone just sort of often assumes that the operating costs are going to be X%, but I think we should be challenging that, saying, do we need that large kind of workforce on site? Do we need all those people involved? And if we can reduce that by automating some of those basic tasks within property management, then those rents don't need to be as high and there's more of a margin. So I think it's about thinking more kind of creatively. And obviously, we can't turn if there are, HMO landlords, private landlords leaving the market, we can't turn every property into a big block of apartments. But tenants don't all want to live in that type of environment. But also it's just not possible from a kind of council perspective. So yeah, any of these kind of retrofit projects are, I think, also a way that we build more affordable housing. One final thing just to say on this topic, is I think it's going back to the amenities conversation, is I think in the residential sector, we can really learn from hospitality. And in hospitality, you have these self-service buildings, amenity light, like Premier Inn and Travel Lodge, that are really high revenue generating businesses that tenants, people want to go and stay in to be able to make a holiday actually feasible. So I think we can really learn in the residential sector from hospitality, and be thinking again how we don't need to have such high operating costs to make more of these affordable and mid-tier products possible.
Thank you, Hannah. James, one area that I think has got a lot of potential in this debate is co-living, smaller unit sizes, which people are happy to live in, providing they have adequate communal areas for lower rents and an all-inclusive bill. What's your take on the potential for co-living to grow and fill a need?
Certainly, it's got potential. And actually, I think that sort of sub-sector of the rental sector has gone through a fair sort of cultural transformation actually in the last few years in terms of policy, because I think it's now a lot more accepted that it has a part to play, whereas not very long ago you would speak to local government representatives and they would just be, well, I mean, it's a terrible thing because we can't have people living like this, and then you sort of quiz them about what do they think they mean by that, and I think it comes back to that sort of cultural point, was that if you're providing housing of any sort, it needs to be long-term permanent housing for the people who are living there, and actually co-living kind of is almost by definition a potentially temporary situation for someone. It serves a really good need for people coming to a new place who don't possibly know people. Perhaps they're coming for a new job. They just need somewhere that's good quality and reliable to get themselves started. There's quite a lot of people who have been in purpose-built student accommodation who, when they stop being students, are used to that sort of accommodation and think, well, I can just move into something else because I'm not allowed to stay in that building anymore. And very little of that exists, and there is a big market for it, and it feeds into that sort of flexibility, particularly I was going to say in the early stages of people's careers, but even in the later stages of people's careers, it serves a really good purpose. I hear from employers in London and elsewhere saying actually one of the biggest recruitment problems they have is housing within the city. They've got work, they can pay decent salaries, but people simply cannot find somewhere that's good enough to live in, and that's or reliable enough to live in, and that's true for people moving around the country, but also coming internationally, as many major cities are. To my mind, it provides a really good, secure, reliable starting point for someone. And I don't think anyone's expecting them to stay there for a very long time, but it's a starting point. perhaps it's their only point if they're just on a short-term contract, as many people are. But if they end up staying in that city longer, they probably will find someone to share a bigger place with, or put down more roots, which is fine, and that's a really good sort of aspirational path. But to expect people to go straight to that end point when they arrive in a new place is probably unrealistic in this day and age. So I think it's got a really big part to play and should be encouraged.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the things that co-living operators have been surprised about is actually how broad the age range is of their customer base. It's not just 20 and 30-year-olds, it's much broader than that. Lisa, going back to one of the slides I showed at the start about the later living situation and the shortfall in provision there, around 9 in 10 of people aged 65 to 79 live in under-occupied housing, with more than half living in homes with 2 or more excess bedrooms. There is a lot of stock in the UK which isn't being used efficiently. So how can we speed up this later living piece and provide appropriate housing for these people and free up the existing stock, which is currently sitting, half empty or more in some cases?
It's a big question. I mean, I think it's about providing the accommodation for those people to move into, but it's not just about the accommodation, it's about the various different models of how that retirement living concept is set up, and that there's a kind of lots of different ways of structuring that, but I'm not sure that any of them are necessarily that attractive to those older people kind of moving from what is a very secure kind of family housing environment into something where they're effectively giving away that equity piece. And I think until those models start to loosen up, I'm not sure there's going to be mass movement really of the market that way, but that need is only going to grow, I think, in terms of the numbers that need that type of accommodation, and that family housing would go a long way to solving some of the issues in the housing crisis. So it is something that needs a solution, but it's because it's part of the ecosystem. There's so many things that are still required to be delivered. You almost end up, as we have done today, talking about later living at the end, and it kind of becomes an end piece of, we need to provide housing for later living as well. And I think that's kind of how it's viewed in kind of general policy terms as well. It's definitely not driving the agenda, whereas in some ways, if it was driving the agenda, then maybe there would be more scope to kind of free things up. I could be radical and say you could kind of wield compulsory purchase powers and get all these people, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to advocate for that, but that would be one solution.
I don't think you might find many politicians advocating for that.
No, absolutely.
I think again, this is where rental homes should come into the market more. I think the idea of going through the purchase process and committing to another big expenditure when you're perhaps in your 80s is not the way forward. But when you look at the demographics around it, it should be one of the most attractive areas for investors and developers. Geeta, have you got a take on that?
Yeah, well, the older person's task force that I was a part of, we looked at this whole question, and one of the key problems is that you need quite a lot of communal space for quite a lot of later living schemes. But then how do you make that viable financially when you're competing against other providers of housing? So really there needs to be some leadership and some focus in terms of how you can grow it, whether that's through planning policy, whether that's through looking at viability and options. But we just treat it the same as everything else, and you can't treat it the same as everything else. So if you look at the States and you look at Australia, there are some very good models and in the UK as well, there's some very, very good models of very very well designed later living schemes and co-living schemes, you know, where people want to live and have a sort of kitchen where they cook together and eat together. So there are different models around, but we don't really think about that in terms of viability and financing. And I think we really need to, as a start, just standardise the definitions. Some people call it later living, some people older persons accommodation, there's sheltered care housing, there's care, there's, you know, so many sort of different definitions. So it's kind of, what do we mean, and how do we want to grow it, and what is it that people want, and being able to incentivize them to move as well. Because at the moment it's a very big thing. If anybody's got older parents or whatever, you know, a move when you're older it's you know, a really big deal. And therefore, you know, finding ways to make it easier for people to move and incentivizing people to move is really important part of that. But I think, you know, that kind of collective leadership from the top, so we don't talk about it last, you're absolutely right, you know, that there is a real push for the outcome, which will release more family housing as well.
Thanks. I'll make a note of that. Next time we have a webinar like this, I'll start with senior living. James, you've got your hand up. Do you want to touch on that quickly, and then I'll come to Hannah?
Yeah, I haven't got much more to add to what Geeta just said, actually, but other than it, just you know, the solution is going to have to be more carrot than stick, because otherwise politically it's unacceptable. But I think there's a more general point there, and when we're talking about under-occupied homes, and that's one that needs to sort of feed into this conversation when we're trying to persuade planning authorities and things, is actually the number of excess bedrooms that people in the rental sector have is tiny compared to the amount in the owner occupation sector. So the data I've seen suggests that, you know, people, if they're buying a house or an apartment, will tend to buy an extra bedroom if they can afford it for future expansion of their own needs. In the rental sector, that's not such a problem, because if you need a bigger place, you can just move to a bigger place fairly simply. So I think the figures are something like, you know, nearly 50% of owner-occupied homes have at least one extra bedroom, and that figure drops to about 10% in the rental sector. So, you know, for the same building, you are going to house more people if it's for rent than for sale, and I think that's an important when you're trying to address a housing need situation. That's an important factor to bear in mind.
Yeah, thank you, James. We've obviously mentioned politics a lot and the government a lot in this conversation. Housing is inherently tied up with politics, which leads to a lot of confrontation, a lot of dogma. Hannah, I'm going to give the last word to you. How can we encourage an approach to housing supply that is pragmatic rather than dogmatic? And I'm going to give James credit for that question because he came up with it. But I'm going to ask you, Hannah.
I hope others chime in. A lot of pressure ending it, but I think I take that question as like pragmatic is using data to lead decisions, and again are stepping away from making assumptions. And I think that's from a legal issue around, like, there shouldn't be us stating that this building should only be purpose-built student accommodation means that if anything changes within that city, you're not allowing flexibility. And us saying that this building is only senior living means that what if there wasn't enough seniors, and actually be able to bring in students could help, students and seniors being the two loneliest subsections of society, bringing those two people together could actually make a really strong community, like we've seen in a lot of examples around Europe. So I think from a government perspective, I think having really strict requirements around certain buildings doesn't actually works against us. And the same from a financing perspective, when uncertain schemes, if they then control who the tenant should be, we should be looking at the data and seeing who actually wants to live in that building, matchmaking tenants based on where they want to live, who they want to live with, what kind of environment and community that they want. And obviously, I'm going to go back to the point I keep on making, which is that we're seeing this is an opportunity with this shift we're seeing in the housing market to review processes and see how we can run things more efficiently. So investing in technology, investing in our operating platforms, and viewing technology as a way to take more control, not losing control, and freeing up our time so that we're automating tasks that can be automated that are done manually, and putting more human resource into creating happiness in that tenant experience, and making sure that doing things that only people can really add value to. So I think that's really where I see the biggest opportunity. And with this kind of shift that everyone's kind of scared of change, I think it's a really exciting opportunity.
Thank you, Hannah. And James, it would be churlish of me not to give you a quick crack at answering the question. So fire away.
Yeah, I think what I mean by that phrase is for a local planning authority to look at all the various sites that are coming across and coming forward for development, and maybe being a little bit more flexible about the parameters they apply to different sites, so that overall they may want or need 35% affordable housing, say, but actually does that rigidly need to apply to every single site? Because then it results in what I've discussed before, which is you just polarize everything and you keep missing the middle section. And so maybe some sites need to be saying, well, actually we're going to relax those obligations on these sites so that we can get some mid-range housing built in a viable way. Otherwise things become unviable.
Thanks, James. Thanks to all of you. Actually, that was a great conversation. We're just going to show a quick series of slides before we wrap it up, and then we'll leave the webinar open for a couple of minutes so you can take some notes from the chat if you wish. I believe there are some slides coming up. Can we have the slides, please? We seem to have a technical issue going on there. Okay, I think we better wrap it up there, folks. Thank you ever so much to James, to Geeta, to Lisa, and to Hannah for their input today. Thanks to you all for watching. We'll see you on the next Urban Living webinar, which is on March the 7th, and that will be looking specifically at single family rental housing. So hope to see some of you there. Thanks for your company today, and have a great weekend, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Hello, we are International Hospitality Media, or IHM for short. IHM is the #1 brand to engage with decision makers in hospitality and real estate. Our 4 multimedia brands lead their respective sectors with breaking news, comments, trends, and opinions across a variety of multimedia solutions. We provide an inspirational community to connect people through world-class events, webinars, podcasts, award schemes, and much more. But let us share our story of who we are and what we do. Over 10 years ago, Piers and George had a light bulb moment to provide expert opinion, comments, and low-cost digital content. And so, they went on a journey over the past decade, creating media platforms to serve the hospitality and real estate industries. We now have an engaged audience with a reach of over 60,000 monthly visitors across our website, 52,500 in our email database across all sectors, and over 68,000 across our social channels. Everything we do challenges the status quo. We believe in thinking differently. We make things simple and very easy to work with us, and we're a friendly bunch too. We offer creative solutions to help you achieve your business goals. Read, watch, listen, and meet with IHM. Connect with us for a chat today. Just look at some of the brands we have worked with recently.